Well, we have been asking the question, who do you follow the last few weeks? And we have been actually following along as 12 individuals were invited by Jesus to join him in his mission. And he begins by training the 12. Now, the way he trained the 12 was not to sit them all down in the synagogue and give them all kinds of lessons there. The way he trained them is that he sent them out to do his work from the get-go. And we've seen how that happened. He began right at the early part, sending them on this short-term mission trip. And they came back and he debriefed with them. And after several months of walking around, watching him do ministry, healing, and caring for people and feeding those who are hungry, finally he sent them away, and he went with them to kind of an out-of-the-way place called Caesarea Philippi, because he has a conversation he wants to have with them now. Finally, it's time for him to ask the question. And the question was simply this: are you with me or not? Are you coming with me on this mission or not? We looked at that question last week, and he answered, or had that question answered, by asking them, who do you say that I am? And after Peter gets it right, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God, it had to have been a great moment for all of them. They'd followed Jesus around. Finally, they realized who he really was. For the very first time, they articulated that. And probably it was a great moment. I suspect there were high fives all around and maybe some chest bumps along the way, because they finally had gotten it right. But no sooner had they done that, and the air went out of the balloon and the excitement faded when they heard what Jesus had to say next. These words, Mark 8:31. So he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again. He spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. They all thought, as they heard Jesus say these words, wait a minute, this is not what we signed up for. We haven't left our homes and our nets and our businesses and our families to follow some loser, someone that's going to end up dead. This isn't what we want for you, Jesus. It's certainly not what we want for ourselves. And so Peter, feeling pretty full of himself because he'd gotten that previous question about Jesus' identity right, ends up setting the master straight, or trying to anyway. But Jesus will have none of it. Look at verse 33. But when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. He said, "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but of merely human concerns." Now, notice when Jesus rebukes here, he's not just rebuking Peter, he is also rebuking Satan, because deeply embedded in Peter's protest is the temptation from the enemy to Jesus to give up on this dangerous mission, this dangerous course that he is headed toward of going all the way to the cross. I mean, Jesus was on this, there's no way to say this nicely, suicide mission. He's going on this suicide mission, and from an earthly perspective, this looks crazy. It makes no sense at all. But Jesus isn't thinking on an earthly perspective. He's thinking from a kingdom perspective with a mission mindset. And so Jesus decides, finally now, they know who he is. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Now I'm going to set you straight on what it means to follow me. Verse 34. Then he called the crowd to him along with the disciples and said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But whoever loses their life for me and for the sake of the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul?" Now, first thing to notice here is that when Jesus says these words, he's not just talking to the 12 here. We're told he's talking intentionally to the entire crowd that's gathered there. These words are for everyone and anyone who wants to follow Jesus. These are not words for a spiritual elite team of superstars. These words are for everyone who wants to follow Jesus. Now, it's a strange way to recruit for your team to tell them these kinds of things, that what you have in store for you is suffering and rejection and death. I mean, what kind of a way to build a team is that? Many of us may be familiar with Sir Ernest Shackleton's expedition to the South Pole back in the early years of the 20th century. We've got a picture of his crew and his ship that ended up getting stuck, frozen in the ice, and then they had to trek across Antarctica on their own. Now, you may know a little bit about that story, but you may not be familiar with Shackleton's famous recruiting ad that was placed in a local London newspaper. This is what the ad said. Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Now, who's going to sign up for a trip like that? And yet, as the story goes, hundreds, indeed thousands of people applied to be part of that team. Now, if you're fact-checking me this morning, no one has actually been able to get their hands on that newspaper ad, although it's been circulating around for years now, and it's been told the story many, many times. And it makes for a killer sermon illustration, because it's the kind of call that Jesus is issuing to his followers. It's a dangerous and it's a difficult sort of a calling. So who would sign up for something like that? Well, most of us don't face kind of extreme threats like this. Christians around the world often find themselves doing just that. I was reading this morning even in Nepal an anti-conversion law that's now in effect, so that if you convert to Christianity, you are subject to 5 years of imprisonment and a huge fine along the way. In China, the government this past couple weeks has just put all kinds of new restrictions on Christians disseminating faith and teachings through the internet along the way. Now, we don't have those kind of risks generally here in America, and yet we still have risks that we face. If you're going to follow Jesus, you're going to face some risks at your school, at your place of work, at your neighborhood. Sometimes we risk estrangement from friends and our family members. Sometimes we jeopardize our popularity or our social status by what we believe. Sometimes we risk being passed over at work for a promotion, or even risk being fired for crossing some kind of a boundary around the way. We might find ourselves risking even our safety at times by caring for people that are sometimes hard to care for, neighbors that are hard to be neighborly to, people that are often dangerous even. Jesus really hasn't promised protection from danger or risk or threat. One of the favorite psalms I suspect of many of us comes from Psalm 121, these words, I lift up my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. Now you think about it. When do you need help? Well, you don't need help when your boat is sailing on smooth waters across the lake. You need help when your boat is sinking. And so while Psalm 121 promises us help it also assumes that we will face dangerous moments and trouble along the way. And so, before we say yes to this invitation to follow Jesus, to partner with him for the good of the world, let's ask the question, so what can I expect from God? And what does he expect from me as we face this dangerous world that we live in? And that's what Jesus is going to answer in these words of his to the disciples here. So let's first consider what Jesus expects from us. And it's the first part of verse 34. The first thing he expects is that we would deny ourselves. He says, then he called the crowd to him, along with his disciples, and said, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves. Now, I don't know what kind of image comes to mind when you think of denying yourself. Maybe you grew up in the church where you heard about spiritual disciplines like fasting or silence or solitude or something like that. And you kind of think about those sort of things as denial. Fasting is the denial of food. Silence is the denial of conversation. Solitude, or simplicity, I guess I should say, is the denial of getting more and more stuff. Now, all of those are spiritually worthwhile practices, but that's not what Jesus has in mind here. He's not talking about those kind of denials. He's talking about the denial of your rights, the denial of your privileges. He's talking about setting aside your comforts, if need be, and your preferences. He's talking about giving up your freedom, maybe your privacy, maybe even your safety. See, those other disciplines like fasting, silence, simplicity, those are the training exercises for the real sacrifices, the real times when you're going to have to be willing to give up your privileges, the things that you prefer along the way. There's all kinds of ways. I see that around here. Like that empty nester who has raised his kids, and he served in the church for many years. And now he has every single right to come to church for an hour on Sunday morning and then go home. But instead, he ends up waiving that right, stays a second hour, and serves those children so that they can be raised in the faith that has meant so much to him all those years. Or I think about that well-resourced couple who, at this stage in their life, could afford a beautiful home and, if they wished, a gated community, but decide instead to forego that, stay in the neighborhood that they have known their neighbors for years and have had a ministry with for years, and keep being a blessing to those people around you. Or think of that hardworking professional who's just graduated with a degree that will get him a job anywhere he wants, and yet decides instead to forego that profession, that career, and to answer a call to another kind of a job or a vocational ministry someplace else in the world. Or I think about that hardworking professional who is slated for a well-earned vacation, but instead of going on a vacation, takes that time to go on a cross-cultural mission trip to a challenging part of the world. See, Jesus expects us to deny ourselves in small ways and in big ways. And so if you are serious about wanting to follow Jesus, here's the first thing he says: expect to deny yourself. Jesus expects us to deny ourselves. The second thing he expects us to do is to take up our cross. Verse 34, he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross. Now, what does that mean? Well, first of all, let me suggest what it doesn't mean. Jesus, when he speaks of taking up one's cross, he's not talking about some personal difficulty or situation you have to live with. Your cross, forgive me if I sound too brash, your cross is not your demanding boss. Your cross is not your ornery neighbor. Your cross is not your hovering in-laws. Your cross is not your bad back or your bad temper or raising a difficult child or caring for ailing parents. Those are all challenging situations in which you will need God's help, but that is not what Jesus is talking about here. When the disciples and the crowd hear Jesus speak about taking up our cross, they all knew what he meant. There's only one thing he could mean. He meant they needed to be prepared to die, to be ready, if needed, to lay down their lives. That's what it meant to take up one's cross. He's talking about taking your life, your hopes, your dreams, your plans for retirement, your plans for your career, your home, your health, your hobbies, your happiness, all of that, and offering it up to God for his purposes, making it available to him, trusting him to do something good with it. Maybe he will make it flourish to your joy and to his glory. Maybe he will allow it to flounder or even fail, again, to his glory and your joy and the good of the world. But this is about taking all that we are, everything we have, and being willing to offer it up to him. That's what Jesus meant when he said, take up your cross. And that's, by the way, the second blank. Jesus expects us to take up our cross. And thirdly, Jesus calls on us to follow him. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. Notice he doesn't say, take up your cross and admire me. He doesn't say, take up your cross and worship me. He doesn't say, take up your cross and learn about me. He doesn't say, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and join a Bible study. Now, those are all fine things to do, but that's not what the call is. The call is to follow Jesus. It's to go. It's to do what he did, to live the way he lived, to be the kind of person he was, to the neighbors that you find in your way, to pay attention to the people that God places in your path, to serve those that God places in your life any way that you can, to forgive people even when they have wronged you in terrible ways. It's to ask questions and enter into conversations and to hang out with people that are far from God. It's all of those kind of things for his mission and for the good of the world. And so, certainly it's true that Jesus may ask us to die for him. But what he really wants is for us to live for him, to live with him, and to live like him, even when that means setting aside our personal comforts and security and our agenda and all the things that matter the most to us. One commentator writes it this way: one cannot live as a disciple the way many people watch TV, sitting in a lounge chair with a remote control in hand, ready to switch stations whenever anything unpleasant, tedious, or demanding appears on the screen. See, Jesus says, if you want to follow me, I want the remote. Let me have that. Put it in my hands, and then go out in the world and do what I ask you to do. Trust me to use you to do good with the people I place in your life. Things that will bring you joy and bring me glory. That will bless the world and deep down give you the kind of satisfaction and purpose in life you could never dream of before. So he's asking us to put our lives, every part of our lives, in his hands for his purpose. So that's the third blank. Jesus expects us to follow him. So as we follow Jesus, we're invited to set aside our preferences, our comforts, even our security. Now, I know that is a big ask. It's a strange way to recruit for your team. But that's what he's asking. That's what he asks. So that's what he expects from us. What is it we can expect from him? Well, that's what Jesus gets at in the next verse. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? What does Jesus mean when he says, whoever loses their life for me will save it? Save it from what? Save it from hell, from eternal separation from God? Yes, certainly that. But he's also talking about this life as well as the life to come. He's talking about being saved from a life of mediocrity and a life of complacency and a life of smallness and meaninglessness and cowardness and regret and apathy. He's saying, what good is it if you gain the whole world, but you lose your soul, lose your life? What good is it, he says, if you gain a beautiful house, but you lose your beautiful family because of the choices you make along the way? What good is it if you gain the reputation that's so stellar in the community that you work in, but you lose your credibility as a follower of Christ because of the compromises you make? What good is it for that son or daughter of yours to win a scholarship to a prestigious school if along the way they bail on their childhood faith because they no longer have a place and room for God or church anymore? What good is that, Jesus asks. And so Jesus gives us the fullness of life. Not just existence, but life. Life with a capital L. That's why I'm struck by and puzzled by, frankly, the NIV's translation here. In verse 37, they translate the word as soul, as if it's different than life, but it's the same word throughout the whole passage. When he says lose your soul, it's lose your life. It's lose who you are. It's lose who you were created to be. It's lose why you've been put here, created here, for the reason God made you. What good is it if you lose that? And so instead, offer it up to him, because ultimately, Jesus says that's where the safety and the security are found, in the everlasting arms of that wise, faithful, and good God. Now, if you're not yet convinced that's true, just talk to some of the people around here who have foregone their privileges and their comforts at times to do those kinds of things, and find out the kind of joy they had. I was talking right before the service to someone that's involved in the Kairos ministry. The kind of joy and purpose and knowing they're used by God when they are willing to give up weekends, to go up to Sterling to serve those inmates or to be trained along the way. Talk to some of our high school students who spent a week the last couple months on a mission trip to LA. Talk to some of the folks who tutor those kids through Whiz Kids and forego an afternoon. They could be doing something else to take care of kids like that. See, the people who give up their lives are the most alive, the most blessed, the most privileged people on the face of the earth. And that's what we can expect when we say yes to this call. Not only do we gain fullness of life, but Jesus gives us the joy of being used by him. And by the way, that's the second blank there. Now, it's gotten awfully quiet in here today because I know this is a big ask. It's a strange way to recruit people for your team. As inspired as we are by Jesus' words, as inspired as you may be from people that serve him in profound kinds of ways, the question you must be asking yourself is, can I really live that way? Am I really willing to say yes to that kind of commitment? Am I really up for that kind of a call? Because if you're like me, you're tempted to say, well, I'm not sure I can do that. I'm not like some of these other superstars that are out there pounding on motel doors on East Colfax or being willing to take time to go up to Sterling. I'm not sure I have that level of courage or commitment. But then I want you to look at the disciples one more time. That group that we've been following around the last few weeks. And here's the question I want to ask. When Jesus put this challenge before them, were they ready at that point to take up their cross and to follow him? Were they ready at that point to lay down their lives? No, they weren't ready. You know how we know they weren't ready? Because they didn't lay down their lives. They had a chance to take up their cross and follow Jesus all the way to Golgotha. But what did they do? They ran away. They abandoned him. They denied him. They betrayed him. They went into hiding. You see, it takes some time to let the Spirit at work in our lives. It takes some time to learn how to follow Jesus. As Philip talked about in his prayer earlier, this doesn't happen overnight. This is a progressive sort of a thing along the way. But what we might be ready for today is to do what they were ready for. They weren't ready yet to take on the cross, but they were ready to take on the next city. They were ready to follow Jesus to the next town. Now, they didn't have to do that. They could have quit right then and there. They could have said to Jesus there in Philippi, Caesarea Philippi, they could have said, this is not what we thought we were getting into. See you later. I'm going back to fishing or back to tax collecting or back to the familiar, comfortable life I had in Galilee. They could have done that, but they didn't. They decided to take the next step, just the next step, to the next town, to answer the next call, the next encounter, to make the next discovery. And one day after the next followed, and day by day, decision by decision, they grew and answered that call, and they changed the world. If you ask anyone who is serious about getting out there beyond the walls to minister to people, if you ask them where they find the courage, where they find the tenacity, where they find the ability to get out there beyond the comfort that they have, they'll say something like, well, you just do it one day at a time. You do it one decision at a time. You wake up, you don't feel like going over to the elementary school to tutor those kids, but you know they're counting on you, so you do it anyway. That Sterling training, or that training for the Sterling Penitentiary, Kairos, is there early on Saturday morning. You don't feel like going. You've got other things you'd rather be doing, but you know the rest of the team is counting on you, so you go anyway. We've got a person around here who each week reads to a blind widower because he can't get any other kind of source of information outside of that. There are times when there's all kinds of other things he could prefer to do, certainly, but he knows that man is counting on him. And see, when you're willing to go out there and do what God asks you to do, you know who you find out there? You find Jesus out there. That's where he is. He's out there. That's where he is. He's with those people. And that's why it is we're called to daily accept Jesus' invitation to join him doing his work in this world. So let me just end with this question. What risky, uncomfortable, difficult thing might Jesus be asking you to do these days? Where might he be asking you to invest your time, your energy, your money, your love? Who might he be asking you to reach out to and show his love and truth to them? And the truth is, whoever it is, wherever it is, whatever it is, however difficult or dangerous it is, this is what he wants you to know. You don't need to be afraid. The safest place in the universe is to be at the center of God's will for your life, of his good and perfect plan for your life. Jesus calls his disciples together that day. He calls us together this day and invites us to set aside our comforts, our preferences, even perhaps our security, for the sake of a greater good and a greater joy. That's the call to be his disciple.